My name is Deborah Shmueli. I'm really delighted to open this workshop on governance structures for emergencies, before, during, and after. It is a workshop that was organized jointly by the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law under Extreme Conditions and the Ministry of Defense. Let me give you a few words of background about the Minerva Center for our guests. We are an Israeli German center which was established by the Minerva Foundation, which is what was the word you told me? An offspring of the Max Planck Foundation in 2012. And we are 4 Israeli principal investigators, Professor Eli Salzberger, Professor Gad Barzilai, and Professor Amnon Reichlman from the Faculty of Law here at the University of Haifa. And I'm from the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies, the non-lawyer in the group that allows us to say that to be interdisciplinary. And we have 4 partners from the University of Feinberg. What we do is we basically look at 3 types of disasters. We look at natural and man-made disasters like hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, nuclear fallout. We look at belligerencies, wars, terrorism, cyber attacks, and we look at socioeconomic meltdowns. And what we do is we look at all of these disasters in the same prism that you're going to talk about in the workshop today: before, meaning mitigation and preparation for response; during, response to a disaster; and after, long-term and short-term recovery. I think we can categorize our research projects into low resolution, mid resolution, and high resolution research. The low resolution is basically big data research. The partner who's been leading this is Professor Dr. Stefan Voigt from the University of Hamburg. One of his projects, for instance, is to look at emergency constitutions in a large number of countries and look at the determinants of and the impacts of these emergency constitutions. Then we have projects which fall into the category of mid-resolution. We've just completed a large project on cyber, which was co-funded by the Ministry of Science. Done an in-house study on emergency legislation in 12 countries, a comparative study. And then we have the high-resolution projects. One example that we just completed are regulatory frameworks for earthquake readiness in Israel. We developed a regulatory system scanning assessment tool, which helped us identify the frictions and the gaps within the regulatory framework. And then, of course, we have conferences like this one, which also falls within the category of high resolution, high-end, actually. So let me say a few words on today's workshop. It has 2 components. The first is comprised of presentations on different perspectives on the governance of emergencies. And this is an opportunity to welcome our international guests, and I am apologizing up front because I think I am going to mispronounce names, and please help me out with this. So first, let me welcome Professor Dr. Sasha Zorgitz from Slovenia. And this was an opportunity that I actually asked how to pronounce it and did it well in private. Sorry. Okay. Almost professor, congratulations. Dr. Matthias Lemke from France, via Germany. Dr. Karen Levy from the US via Israel, right? Okay, now I need help. Dr. Rute Neto Rita, tell me.
You should only say the first one and the last one.
Only the first and last? That's so much easier.
That fits easier.
Okay, so let me try it. Professor Rute Sarabia.
So it's Saraiva.
Ruth Saraiva, thank you. And Professor Jorge Saraiva, correct? No, George.
Yes.
Okay, so I made all the possible mistakes from Portugal.
No.
No, I could make more.
We have a writer in Portugal, that's pronounced patriotically erroneous names.
Uh-huh. So I've done it well, so thank you. Now we have two people who are joining us via Skype. Professor Giovanna Domincio from Italy, I apologize if you're already listening, and Professor Dr. Adriana Di Stefan from Sicily. A warm welcome and thank you for coming. Commentators for this part of the workshop will be Professor Gad Barzilai, who's the Vice Rector of the University of Haifa, previous Dean of the Law Faculty, and a Principal Investigator in the Minerva Center, and I'm sure he'll join us shortly. Dr. Nadav Dagan, is Nadav here yet? He is a postdoctoral fellow in the Minerva Center. Dr. Myriam Feinberg, who's a former, but there's never former, postdoctoral fellow in the Minerva Center. Drs. Itamar Mann, congratulations, he has just had a baby, right? So he's...
There is 14, but 14 days.
14 days of second baby, right? And so Itamar won't be able to stay the entire time, but we're thrilled that he could still be here. And Dr. Daniel Ben-Olia, not here yet. Both of them are from the University of Haifa Law Faculty. The second component of the day focuses on the new Israeli draft legislation for preparedness of the home front for the state of emergency. We have Advocate Batya Zaks, who's who's a former legal advisor to the Home Front Command and currently consultant to the National Emergency Management Authority. Advocate Iran Shmueli, who is not here yet and not a relative. Strategic advisor, major in the reserves of the Israeli Defense Forces, the National Search and Rescue Unit. Advocate Kobe Iveston, not here yet. Member of the legislation drafting expert group for the new piece of legislation. And Dr. Brigadier General retired Mayor Elran from the Institute for National Security Studies. He's also not here yet, and they will be presenting the Israeli context. Professor Eli Salzberger, Director of the Minerva Center and the German and European Studies Center of the University of Haifa and former Dean of the Law Faculty, will facilitate the roundtable discussion to follow the presentation of the proposed Israeli legislation. Special thanks to Advocate Mayan Rosenstock from the legal office of the Ministry of Defense, who really helped incredibly to organize this conference, and Advocate Haz Ben-Ari, who's traveling abroad. Last and definitely not least, many thanks to Minerva's Advocate Ido Rosenzweig and Dr. Advocate Michal Ben-Gal, who've really been the catalyzers and organizers of today's workshop. I'm wishing us a fruitful and enjoyable workshop. I have to apologize because I actually have to be in Jerusalem at around 12 o'clock. So I'm going to watch it on the YouTube, but I'll at least get to listen to the beginning. So our first speaker is Matthias.
Thank you, Becky.
So good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for this kind introductions and Please let me begin with some preliminary remarks. And the very first one is that I'm very sorry that you can only see my back. Actually, I'm sorry to that. I'll try to stick at least one time into your direction while I'm talking. And but on the other hand, I will more or less address these.
Maybe we should actually, since there are seats here, maybe everybody could. Oh well, then. Okay.
I think they are fine there, and I'll try to address them too. And I think this will work out.
Okay.
So thank you also for inviting me to talk to you today and having me here in Haifa. And it's been my first time to be here in Israel. And I already had this fantastic view when I landed on Tuesday at the Tel Aviv Ben Gurion Airport. And we have this very beautiful sunset after this 3.5 hours flight. It was a wonderful view. And now again, I have a very wonderful view, which makes it even more complicated to speak to the talk I want to give. So please pardon me if once during this talk I am not so focused anymore and will perhaps more or less be looking around and looking outside. Because if you know, the German Historical Institute in Paris, where I'm right now working at, is in the very center of the town of Paris, which is in the Marais quarter of the town, and there also we have a very nice view where you can see the La Tour Montparnasse and Notre Dame. But anyhow, you can't compare the view you have there to the view you have here. So I won't say which view I prefer, but let's leave it there. So, what do you want me to answer to that? So what I'm trying to present today is I'm trying to give you some thoughts on the state of emergency, the État d'urgence in France. And before I get started, before starting, I have to give you a confession. I have to make a confession, which is that I'm actually not a legal scholar, but I'm a political scientist. And I think looking at state of emergency practices from a political science or a social scientist perspective is somewhat different than legal scholars do it. You will see while I'm presenting the paper and how far there isn't. So when I'm talking about the state of emergency in France, which was starting, as you all know, on November the 13th, 2015, after the attacks at Stade de France, at some cafes at the 10th and 11th arrondissement in Paris, and after the shooting at the hostage taking at the Bataclan Theater. We are now looking back from November the 1st on 719 days of state of emergency in France. And I want to reflect these 719 days by doing two major steps. First step will be to talk about what is state of emergency in France, what does that notion mean, first in a general perspective, and then regarding the legal provisions in the French Constitution and the French law. And second, and that is where the political scientists will come through, is what actually happened during these 719 days. So what are the various dimensions of state of emergency? And therefore, I'd like to propose to give you some 4 dimensions, which I will present in the second part, which are the dimension of the events that took place, the political dimension, the legal dimension, and the time frame of what happened. And after that, after these 2 major parts of this hopefully very short talk, I will come back to a short conclusion, and then I'm there for having a discussion, and I'm very much looking forward to your comments. So when you look at the state of emergency situation in France, the 719 days between the 13th of November and the 1st of November 2017, you will see that state of emergency did have a great impact on the French political environment, on the French political legal situation, and then things have changed actually in France. The point is not that much that France has changed like was the case in Turkey. where a state of emergency was issued after the coup d'etat of the military in July 2016, where we have then seen major changes in constitutional order in Turkey. But anyway, in France, the situation changed as well. And that made me come up with a point that I already wrote in the abstract I sent to Ido and Michal, and I did not want to criticize you actually for the title you gave to this workshop. It is state of emergency before, during, and after a crisis situation or a national emergency. And I'm not sure if there is an after in France. Is there any after of a state of emergency in France? I would say there isn't any. We are still, besides the fact that from a legal perspective we have ended the état d'urgence in France, we are still somewhat in a state of emergency situation. So my point or my argument shall be to present reasons for why there is still an ongoing state of emergency situation in France, although legally speaking the situation has ended on November 1st, 2017. So let me start with the first point. Let me add just one very short apology. So as I was presented, I'm a German working in a French institution in Paris, and now trying to speak English. That is somewhat difficult to me because you know what I sometimes do is I'm thinking German, talking about French issues, and then trying to speak English using French words, pronouncing them in English. So if there is some sort of situation coming up where you don't understand what I'm saying, please let me know, and then I'll correct my language. Okay, so sorry for that. So when you come up to ask what is a state of emergency, you can find, of course, as you all know, various definitions of how a state of emergency can be understood. And there is one definition that I very often stick to, which was issued by Bernard Manin in 2015, which goes back to a paper he wrote in English some years before. And he says that state of emergency, or what a state of emergency is about, is the following. He says that state of emergency offers some sort of institutions that permit for a defined period of time the restrictions of certain constitutional provisions if circumstances require it. So this definition issued by Bernard Manin contains three major elements. First, a state of emergency contains the suspension of fundamental rights, which are in most cases granted by the Constitution. Second, by suspending these fundamental rights, a state of emergency creates a special circumstance for governments. And third, the suspension is limited in time. This definition is already good because it's a very, very short and a very precise definition, although I'm not quite satisfied with it, and therefore I came up with another definition of what a state of emergency might be, and this definition is that state of emergency is simply an enlargement of government capacities in crisis situations. And when you compare these two definitions, the one from Bernard Manin and the second I came up with, there is only one major difference, and that is the difference lies in the notion or the perception of time. Bernard Manin stresses the fact that the state of emergency on a certain moment will end. And I, for my part, I'm not so sure about that. That is that governments, even legally or following their political interest or even accidentally, can come up with political decisions and legal provisions that maintain an emergency order, although they perhaps wanted already to leave it. So when you look at these two definitions, you can also see that the state of emergency is, let's say, some sort of a tool for crisis government. And This tool is a very old tool, actually. It's a very simple and therefore old tool that has been used from the Roman dictatorship in Roman times, coming up then via Machiavelli until our days. And you had some sort of a different tradition in the Lockean political thought, which comes up with the idea of prerogative. But basically, this idea of suspending government, suspending fundamental rights, limiting fundamental rights in favor of government intervention capacity is a very, very simple mechanism. So when you look to France, then how is this mechanism implemented in the French legal framework? In France, you have a very vast opportunities, a very vast tool set for emergency government. When you look at the Constitution of the Fifth Republic from 1958, you will first find that there are two articles in the Constitution itself which are related to emergency government. This is Article 16, which contains the plein pouvoir du président de la République. And this is, on the other hand, Article 36, which contains the État de siège, which is for the situation when France is attacked by from the outside and therefore has to react on it. So besides these Article 16 and Article 36 of the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, you have a third tool. And interestingly, this third tool does not really come from the Fifth Republic, but it was implemented before. It was implemented in the ending process of the Fourth Republic, but is the only tool that has ever been used in the Fifth Republic from 1958 to our days to issue a state of emergency, an état d'urgence in France. And this is the law 385 of 1955 from the 3rd of April 1955. And when you are aware of the historical situation France was in at this time, you will find that the law was issued during the conflict in Algeria. As you might know, Algeria contained 3 French departments, départements, 3 French, let's say, administrative units, and was considered to be part of France, was some sort of a mainland France at that time. So when they had to deal with this military conflict emerging in Algeria at that time, France politicians found that neither the Article 16 nor the Article 36 of the Constitution would really work, because they didn't have a constitutional crisis, nor were they attacked from the outside, because Algeria was an internal problem. So they had to come up with the law from 1955 on the État d'urgence, and this État d'urgence law from 1955 was the only one that was used until today when it comes to declare a state of emergency. So this is very roughly actually the first part that I wanted to give you. So what is the state of emergency was the issue of, let's say, a crisis-related increase of government capacities, which is not necessarily limited in time. And when you look to France, which laws do you use? When it comes to enlarge the government's capacities in times of crisis, it has always been in the Fifth Republic, the law 385 of 1955. So that would be the first part. In the second part, I would now like to look how this very law was used in the time that we had from November the 13th, 2015 until November the 1st, 2017. And there had been some uses of this law before, namely in the context of the Algerian War in 1958, 60, 61. Then later on, during the process of independence of New Caledonia in 84 to 88, then in the banlieue unrests in 2005, we had this famous expression by former French Minister of the Interior, Nicolas Sarkozy, who said that you should clean up all these banlieue character and just to get rid of all these people there. And now we have the state of emergency, or we had it from 2015 to 2017. So, what are these four dimensions of the use of state of emergency? The very first dimension is, and I think is a very obvious dimension. It's what I call the dimension of the events. So, what actually happened? The attacks of November 13 and 14, 2015, as you might all know, occurred in a situation of high tensions within the security framework or security situation or perception of the French Republic. There have been 5 attacks or events before state of emergency was issued, and the most prominent ones were the following 2, which occurred on 2 subsequent days in January 2015. First one was the Charlie Hebdo massacre, killing 12, injuring 11 people, and the second one, that was on January 7th, 2015, and the other was the hostage taking in a Jewish supermarket at the Port de Vincennes, killing 5 and injuring 9. Interestingly, these situations were not followed by a state of emergency. Then we had, as I already mentioned in the introduction, some 10 months later, the suicide bombing at the Stade de France, which was the very first suicide bombing in France, the drive-by shootings at several cafes in the 10th and 11th arrondissement, and the hostage taking in the Bataclan Theater, killing only this evening in Paris and surroundings 137 people and injuring 430. Which, even when the events were ongoing, which led to a press conference by François Hollande and issuing or declaring a state of emergency in this evening. He did this around about 11 p.m. on the 13th, and the hostage taking at the Bataclan Theater, which was still going on, ended around about 1 or 2 a.m. on the 14th. During the state of emergency and until today, we did have at least 9 more attacks or events that occurred related to Islamist terrorism or to terrorism in general in France that had a major impact. And among them was, as you all might recall, the attack in Nice on July 14th, the French national holiday, 2016, using a truck and killing 86 people at the Promenade des Anglais and injuring 485. Then the attack at the Paris-Orly airport on March 18, 2017, killing 1 and injuring 1. And the latest attack was on April the 20th, 2017, on the Champs-Élysées, right in the heart of Paris, killing 2 by drive-by shooting and injuring 3. So when you look at this stream of events, what do we have? We have a continuous series of attacks or events related to Islamic terrorism that already occurred before and also during the state of emergency, which ended on November the 1st, 2017. Some of these attacks caused an until then unknown number of dead civilians after World War II in France. So the death toll was very, very high, so that created supposedly a very impressive situation for then President François Hollande to declare state of emergency, which leads me to the second dimension, is the dimension of politics. Right under the impression of what was going on in his declaration on November the 13th, but he repeated that sentence, unfortunately, on November 16th, when he talked to the Congress and the Château de Versailles. François Hollande said, "La France est en guerre." France is at war. And when you look back a little bit in history, you will recall that this sentence was used at least one more time before in relation to terrorist events. Perhaps you all know it, but I'll repeat it here again. It was on September 20th, I think, 2001, used by George W. Bush. So bringing together warfare and terrorism, although terrorism is more or less a strategy. There's an interesting book by Louis Richardson, who is asking herself, what do terrorists want and how do we, can we react on what they are doing? And then she says, well, actually, as terrorism is a strategy, making warfare on terrorism as a strategy doesn't make any sense because you can't win it. Making a war a strategy, you will never create a situation that you can win. But unfortunately, François Hollande repeated that sentence again, and therefore put France in a situation where it found itself in a warlike situation. This was one reaction from politics, being in war. There are two others that I want briefly to point out. The second was from former Prime Minister Manuel Valls, who was responsible under the government of François Hollande, who said that, well, basically, France didn't have sufficient legal provisions to deal with terrorist threats, so that terrorists knew that and therefore were willingly attacking France because France was so weak. So therefore, he said, in order to prevent further terrorist attacks to occur, France needed to improve its anti-terrorist legislation. This was a whole discourse that was issued in a very early period of the state of emergency application, and then leading to an enhancement of state of emergency legislation itself, where we'll come back to in the next point. But basically, it all goes back to the point that France's anti-terrorism law is not efficient enough and therefore needs improvement. And the third dimension of the political discourse is some sort of a later discourse, which occurred after the presidential election in March 2017, when Emmanuel Macron was elected president. Then the new government and in there, the Minister of the Interior, Gerard Collomb, came up with the idea that, yes, the law had improved, it's getting better, but the terrorist threat has become permanent. So the idea of permanency of the threat was then a discursive motive that was made up and was used to legitimize other steps, other political steps, which Myriam will come to in the next dimension. But also there you have that shift from France is at war, France is weak, terrorist threat is permanent, which somewhat sums up the public discourse that you had in politics. So this is, let's say, three major discursive parts that you could observe when you look to parliamentary debates and public discourse. Brings me to the third dimension, which is the legal or the law dimension of state of emergency in France. As I already said at the beginning, state of emergency in France is enshrined in two major legal frameworks, which are the Constitution, here the Article 16 and 36, and the law, sorry. This was this moment when I tried to pronounce French words. And the law 55/385. All state of emergency policies from 2015 to 2017 were based on the last law mentioned, which was, as I already mentioned as well, made to tackle the civil war in former French colony Algeria from 1954 to 1962. During this period of these 719 days, the state of emergency was renewed 6 times after it had been declared from former President Hollande and therefore was valid from November 13 to November 1st, 2017. The first, and now I'm sorry, but you will tell me if it's too much, but I'm afraid we have to go through these 6 different stages because there are some slight changes that might be important to show in how far there is a qualitative change in managing and handling the state of emergency applications. The first thing, yeah, sure.
What is this 385 state?
Yeah, actually, this is the French logic of naming laws. So this only means that you have this numérotisation, that you give numbers to the laws.
What is the state?
It's on the État d'urgence, on the state of emergency. That's the title of the law.
So, does it say conditions?
Yeah, I will come back to that. I will come back to that. Because actually, yes, it says when shall a state of emergency be used and what possibilities do government agencies have when it comes to a state of emergencies. But the interesting point, and therefore I'm coming to that, is that they made major changes to the law during the state of emergency, actually. So the law that you had when it came up in 1955 didn't have that many changes, actually. It was applied in a very, very safe manner. That's why the French Prime Minister Manuel Valls at that time said, well, we don't have sufficient legislation at all because it's from 1955. So now we have some sort of modern terrorism. Deborah said some sort of cyber terrorism. We were not prepared to have that, to handle that, Manuel Valls said as well. So that's why I didn't talk about that, because they changed it, actually. But I'll come back to that, and if you have any questions, then please ask me again if I didn't answer that. So the first state of emergency was declared then on November 2015, and the declaration was followed by a law, and that was the law 2015-1501, extending the state of emergency until February 26, 2016, for 3 months in that point. And this declaration of state of emergency by a law contained several reforms of the legal provisions. For example, what they abolished, actually, and that was some of the reforms they had. The ancient law contained some possibilities of censorship. That means in a state of emergency, government could decide that a newspaper should not publish or shouldn't. And then, therefore, there was a very interesting talk on that in the Assemblée Nationale, which said, well, what we want as a government and what we need to have in those times, which are critical times also with regard to our democracy, we have to have transparency. We have to inform the people. And therefore, we don't want to have censorship anymore. On the other hand, in an era of social media, Twitter, Facebook, we're on YouTube right now. So how do you want to implement censorship in a situation where civilians, normal people that are around the scene, will have posted those things even before security workers occur on the scene? So, but that was one simple change they made. Another change that they made was that they extended the periods of arrest before the respective case could have must be presented before a judge. So they extended that from 48 hours to 96 hours. So if you want to, in a general perspective, they enhanced government capacity. They gave them more opportunity. The second state of emergency was then declared by law in 2016. That was the law 2016-162, extending it until May 26, once again for 3 months. That was one prolongation that they made that was not that very interesting, because besides 3 months, that nothing really changed, nothing really happened. And the third state of emergency was declared by law again, was the law 2016-629, extending it until August 26, 2016, again for 3 months. And that was majorly legitimized by the fact that there was the Haifa Euro Cup going on in France in June and July. So they want to have safe situations, safe games, and therefore extended state of emergency again, but having the plan to abolish it after that. Yeah, all right. I will do that. That fits to my time frame. Thanks. As you know, and as I already told, there were these attacks in Nice that occurred, so state of emergency was prolonged again. And then we had it fourth state of emergency for then 6 months, and then the fifth for at about 5 months, which was intended to cover the presidential and parliamentary elections in 2017. The sixth state of emergency was then the first one to be decided by the Macron government, and it was the law 2017-1154, extending it until November 1st, 2017. And then Macron and his government already pronounced their intention to replace the state of emergency by appropriate measures allowing the authorities to strengthen public security to fight against terrorism. And that's strengthening then came into life by what was called after November 1st, 2017, la loi renforçant la sécurité intérieure et la lutte contre le terrorisme, which is the law enforcing the interior security, internal security, and fight against terrorism, which adopted, for example, the possibility of house searches, arresting people, the suspension of manifestations, and so on, which are now part of the normal legal framework, but which are not longer part of the emergency framework. So there is some sort of normalization going on. So there are perhaps two major findings with regard to the hypothesis of the normalization of the state of emergency when you look only at its legal dimension. Firstly, the law, the state of emergency is based on, was itself subject to change within a state of emergency, which is not illegal itself, but might raise questions with regard to the democratic quality of such a legal procedure. Secondly, for a state of emergency sorry, I have to get through this sentence. But the point is that we have after we have seen 2 years of a state of emergency, we have now, which is some sort of an extra legal framework, we have now some of the provisions that entered into a normal law and therefore are extended for now for at least the next 3 years. That means that this law, which is part of the normal legal framework, will be valid for the next 3 years and then might continue to be working. I would have a very short remark on the time dimension, but I will keep that very short, which would be the fourth dimension, just saying that when you look at the way the state of emergency reforms were adopted, you will find that a whole legislation process was pushed through the parliament within 5 days. That was at the beginning of reforming the state of emergency. On the other hand, you have that time dimension saying that terrorism and fighting terrorism became a permanent phenomenon. So there is no normality of time anymore, but either time is very compressed, getting very, very short, or on the other hand, there is no time anymore because once things are becoming permanent, there is no measure of time. So allow me just 3 brief sentences for conclusion. And with regard to the title of your conference. I think it's easy to identify a time that can be qualified as before an emergency, and this is the moment when nothing has happened yet. So that's very easy. Identifying the time that can be qualified as during an emergency is already much more difficult. Once an attack occurs, this does not necessarily mean that a state of emergency will be declared. See the attacks in January 2015. One could suppose that these and the following attacks triggered the declaration of a state of emergency, which then followed on November 13, 2015. The during has, from a de jure perspective, a definitive beginning, but from a political, social, or cultural point of view, the beginning of the during is not that clear. And the last concluding remark is about identifying the after of a state of emergency, at least for the French case, which is rather easy again. There isn't any after. This is mainly due to the fact that legal provisions that were only 2 years ago, in November 2015, reserved for exceptional circumstances, have now, in November 2017, entered into legal normality. With this new quality that refrains from the label of exceptional measures, it will be far more complicated to get rid of these extensions of executive competences in future. Sorry for being long. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you to the Minerva Center for providing me with the opportunity to respond to this paper, which is on a topic I myself work on. know a bit. And I'm very pleased, therefore, to offer some hopefully constructive discussions and praise. So Dr. Matthias Lemke's paper is examining the state of emergency that was declared in 2015 after terrorist attacks, and that was officially and legally ended on the 1st of November 2017, making it just under 2 years. But as is generally considered by experts and lawyers, in practice, the state of emergency didn't really end, because in practice it was replaced instead by yet another terrorism law that basically enshrined in permanent and regular legislation a number of the powers that were only granted under the state of emergency. And just as in response to your question, the state of emergency law, which allowed an original state of emergency for 12 days to be then renewed by Parliament, allowed house arrests, curfews, the closing of public places, etc. And the new law includes some of these measures, extends some of them, and therefore allows arrest, curfews, seizure of data that is found in the house arrest. The closing of public places also for broader reasons than the state of emergency measure. It does have also, it does enshrine in the legislation a judicial review of these measures by the administrative courts. That France has a civil courts and the administrative. So what Matthias argues in his paper and for the purpose of this conference is that in practice we don't actually see an after the emergency, and that instead it becomes a permanent emergency. And the way that Matthias shows it is that it's through a sort of a silent or I would say subtle steps rather than a sort of a more brutish one like in Turkey. And Matthias' paper uses a number of very interesting angles to look at this topic and provide some contributions. And I won't necessarily deal with your points chronologically in the paper, but I'll make a couple of small points and then focus on the permanence of emergency. So one of the contributions which I found really interesting is the description of the various legal changes through the stages of the state of emergency, which lasted 2 years, but actually went through 6 different stages, which you unpick in the paper. Sort of the various incarnations of the state of emergency, and that allows you to describe the sort of subtle and silent change. This shows that the state of emergency wasn't changed only through its framework, the time framework, but also through the powers that it granted. So not only that it was extended, but in some cases it allowed extra powers to the executive. I'll get back to this. Another contribution which I found interesting was the proposal of the definition of an emergency, and that proposal doesn't include the element of time. So I'll just again use it, the enlargement of government capacity in crisis situations. And so therefore, in this definition, we focus on the concept of crisis, not as a temporal context, but rather on the consequence, on concentration of executive powers. And you use this definition to reflect the fact that despite legal limits that are included in the text, the reality is instead in a shift of we move away from the regular separation of power and we focus on executive measures. And here I would have maybe liked a little bit more discussion on sort of just the concept of état d'urgence, état d'exception, exception and emergency, so whether that would sort of possibly help your argument. And then, despite making away with time in your definition, you actually use it as one of your elements And I think these four elements are a very useful way of examining the issues that you bring up, to examine sort of the reality of an état d'urgence. So I'm not going to go through again these 4 points. I would maybe, as a lawyer, have included references to the judicial review that does exist both in the original law and in the new terrorism law, and also the role possibly of the parliament, because we talk about the focus on executive measures, but the parliament in this case was approving the extension of an état d'urgence. So it's not the government that was deciding; it was approved by the parliament. And I think this is an important point. And some lawyers have just said that the parliament has become a tool to the executive. But that's just a point. And the point I want to focus here on is the shift between this shift between emergency and normalcy, and permanence. And I just want to make the parallel more generally with the context of terrorism. A number of the points that you're raising in your paper apply also to issues of terrorism and counterterrorism more generally, and especially since 9/11. And some of these points are actually inherent to counterterrorism and predate 9/11, but we do see it increasingly, obviously, after 9/11. And so a couple of the points that appear in your paper, one is the speed of adoption of counterterrorism measures. So you mentioned that the law of emergency itself was amended during the state of emergency, which legally raises a number of issues, but also that the amendments were adopted without much debate and in the space of 5 days. And this is a phenomenon which is very common in terrorism legislation, where you do see the feeling that the government has to immediately respond to the threat by a new law, because the idea that the existing law is not sufficient, and we have to have a fast response. And in parallel, or in addition to sort of this fast-track legislation, you also have the fact that sometimes the executive instead will adopt the terrorism measures instead of legislation. So either have fast-track legislation without much debate, or in addition, executive measures that will deal with terrorism. And you show in your paper both had the sort of the legal focus of state of emergency favors executive power, but also this has been transferred into regular legislation. So we now have sort of an increased executive power in regular legislation. And also, as a political scientist, you've showed how the narrative of permanence will also further the extension of executive power. So both the sort of the legal counterterrorism framework and the narrative of permanence will allow the executive power to be strengthened. And therefore, one question which is relevant here is whether we should treat terrorism as an exceptional threat that does need exceptional measures, or if it is a daily occurrence that needs permanent and regular legislation. And in fact, in your paper, you're asking if in practice even get to ask this question, because we're now in a situation in France where we don't have an after an emergency. We don't even get to ask anymore whether we are in an emergency or in a regular situation. Instead, we're in a permanent emergency. And what is interesting, I think the point that you made is that not every attack will lead to a state of emergency. And so therefore it's not an automatism to resort to state of emergencies, but that once a state of emergency is adopted, it is hard to get out of it. And this instead will sort of raise the standards of what is acceptable and the threshold of the legality of our response. And then one final point I would like to make is 2 points, sorry, to add. The permanent emergency, which is not necessarily as a state of emergency, but more subtly, and there's an article by Rachel Kleinfeld who referred to Haifa Chappelle, who's working on emergencies, and Rachel Kleinfeld says we're already in a state of emergency in America. Not in a formal way, there is no adoption of a state of emergency, but through the counterterrorism legislation since 9/11, we're in effect in a state of emergency. The US Patriot Act adopted very fast, which is still in place despite being supposed to be repealed, and is now still in place. And then the final point I want to make is maybe to add a bit more in your paper on the narrative of war, because it's also linked to sort of permanent and temporary, because traditionally war used to have an end, and therefore you would be able to sort of have an end to a conflict. But terrorism doesn't necessarily have an end, and therefore it would be interesting to see whether this use of the narrative of war contributes to your point on permanent emergency.
Matthias, if it's okay, we'll collect some questions and remarks, and then you'll have a chance to comment. I'd like to start, and I think it's important because this is the first paper, just to make 2 conceptual points with regard to the title of the conference and your remarks. First, question of before, during, and after. Okay? What we mean, okay, is a legal framework that obliges the authorities to prepare for a state of emergency. And this is something which is the main focus of the new Israeli draft bill. For example, it obliges the government to have a discussion of various scenarios of emergencies and to construct a plan. This is a very innovative thing in Israeli. Or preparing, you know, every building standard is preparation for emergency. But we had recently a very, very heated debate here in Haifa about the big ammonia storage place, which is down here in normal times. It's okay, of course, if missiles will hit it, it will cause major damage. So preparation for emergency is exactly all these things to try to mitigate possible various different emergencies, including, of course, terrorism attack. You know, if you construct differently pavements, that cars cannot really go on the pavements, this is a kind of measure that is taken before. And the question is, from a legal perspective, who is responsible, what are the duties, and how we actually enforce this. After, okay, the question of recovery is also very important. If you have a mass disaster and you want to go to normality very quickly, you have various avenues. Some of them are within the current rule of law, some of them are not. What happened, for example, after 9/11 is something very exceptional. No insurance or any state, you know, legal framework was employed, but President Bush just appointed a person, gave him huge amount of money, and said, divide it to all the victims according to the criteria that you will decide. It was actually an appointment of a dictator, okay, how to compensate people in order to bring normality as fast as possible. So this is what we mean before, during, after. Second remark relates to what is apparent also in France, and this is basically the 3 practices or models of dealing with emergency. Okay? And you always refer to emergency constitution or declaration of emergency. In declaration of emergency, the law changes for a certain period of time, and then we return to normality. But as we know, we have 2 other models. Okay, the British model, which you implied actually is now being practiced also in France, that actually we don't have a real change of the rule of law for a temporary period, but we have a change for a permanent period. So we have we don't have emergency, we have a new normality. Okay? And there is a third model, which is also apparent in France. And this is stepping outside the rule of law. In emergency, it's not that we change the rules for a limited time or change the rules permanently, but we actually do something that is illegal, and some people even advocate, some scholars advocate this model as better than the emergency constitution, because then we know that we step outside the rule of law, and this cannot go forever, so maybe time-wise, the effects over a long period of time will be much better for the polity. But, you know, the Article 16 of the French Constitution is actually stepping outside the rule of law, okay, because it gives the president unlimited powers. It's not that he has some certain additional powers, but it's unlimited power. And although it's in the under the auspices of the Constitution, basically it doesn't meet the basic conditions of the rule of law. So this is the question whether the French experience in recent terror attacks implies that maybe stepping outside the rule of law is a better model, because basically the emergency constitution model is not failed, because as you said, it was prolonged and shifted from emergency to normality. So maybe we should think about another model. These are the two clarifications, but I think we should open it for additional comments and remarks. Kevin.
Just for the sake of
yeah, I just wanted to, I'm not sure, yeah. So I just want to add to the issue of understanding the time. So you're related to this before, during, and after the state of emergency. So before, during, and after the legal framework. I think the title had to do with the idea of emergency management, which is an ongoing temporary temporality from before the acts of preparation, during the response, and then during the real-time response, and then the after is really picking up the pieces and preparing for the next event. So it's not, it's this ongoing, this is the structure of the management that never really ends, but has this temporal aspect to it. And Manin, his critique, so I think a little bit mispronounced his definition, because so for him, temporality, the fact that we have to be, that the state of emergency has to have limits, is an aspect of the doctrine of emergency. Again, so it's not the definition of emergency, but it's the definition of the doctrine of emergency, which has to include that aspect of temporality. And if it doesn't, like terrorism, that means we're not in the doctrine anymore. We're doing something else. We're in a different world of regulation. So I think that's the
any more? So, of course. All right, let's read the name schedule, but it's always space.
Try to be as brief as possible, but depending on the comments, I have to say something.
We have the first paper this time.
Thank you very much for that. No, thank you very much for these two comments, and let me perhaps pick to 1.5 issues in there. Karen came up with the time issue and the definition of phenomena, and yes, sure, I just came up with my English translation from his French translation from his English paper, so that was a little bit blurred, and I'm sure. So sorry for that. And I also see that in his conception, it's some sort of a theoretical perspective, or the doctrine of state of emergency, which then, for example, is manifested in the Roman model of dictatorship. Sure. So there obviously is this temporal limit, which is in the dictatorship until a certain point in Sulla and Caesar and so on. But my only critique would be that when he is insisting so much on this temporal limit, there are some evidence, there are some empirical findings that just don't fit to his theoretical definition anymore. So therefore, I would not be so much focused on this temporal limitation, but just to keep it open, because politics also is about keeping things open, changing things, making things possible that were not possible before, in the good and in the bad. So that would have been, but we can come up to that on a coffee break again. That would be my critique on this use of the notion or the idea of time. So, the second thing is, actually, thank you for clarifying this conference title for me. And one could still ask the question if it's really possible to that much distinguish between these three periods of time, between the before, the during, and the after, because I think any of these periods strongly affects the other. And there's one thing that I didn't mention during the presentation, but which perhaps also responds a little bit to your question you had during the talk, was, and you mentioned it too during your answer to my talk, was actually what did they do? What happened? And there have been, for example, house searches. France has seen, and there are two reports, I think they are even in English, so they should be available on the internet. There are two reports by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, which are on the state of 2016, the end of 2016. I think there are no more current reports on that. But they are both reporting that France has seen some sort of 4,500 house searches, mainly describing a practice where police forces come to your home between 1 o'clock in the morning and 3 o'clock in the morning, just opening the front door by violence, even if a key is proposed to open the door, then bringing people out, bringing old people out, bringing children out without having that much care for these persons. So they don't have any cars or people to take care of them or to go to. So when you look at the numbers there, you have in this during the emergency, you have less than 1% of these house searches who led to legal prosecution related to terrorism. So the question is, of these 4,500 house searches, you have 4,450 roundabout who had dealt with people who were not involved in terrorism activities at all. And that brings us then to the after. What will happen to these people? What will happen to their perception of the French Republic, of the French state and its police forces? Knowing that now, under the new law, this practice is still allowed, they can still come, but they don't call it house searches anymore, but they call it visits. So they can come just visiting you, knocking a little bit stronger on your door at 3 a.m. in the morning, saying, hello, are you there? And are there any weapons of mass destruction in your flat? So this is where I think that the distinction between the during and the after is getting blurred. And my perspective, as I tried to say in the beginning, was actually it was difficult for me to address this question that you asked here from a political science perspective, because there are so many dimensions involved of things that are starting, effects that are creating, and the aftermath of these effects. For example, the aftermath of these 4,500 house searches that have been taking place in France. So it's a complicated issue, and from a normative perspective, a normative democratic perspective, I think we have to really take care about the after, because if we don't, perhaps the situation won't get better, but will get worse from a democratic. Thank you.
Just short remark.
One more question.
It's interesting because from the papers, I understood that the law before the change to emergency was that the police is not allowed, right, to go to any properties after 10 in the evening. And one of the terrorists managed to escape because the police during emergency really kept this law. And of course, one can ask, this is before, if this law is justified in normal times, and maybe, the overreaction of the new legislation and practice are actually because of the very, very strange, relaxed law that police cannot really go into your private home after that. Okay, we'll move to the second paper.